I hope today will be a very successful day. I don't know how many people in the audience know about Learning for Public Health West Midlands. We are an organisation that's been around now for about 5 or 6 years, commissioned by the Directors of Public Health from the West Midlands to provide an interprofessional CPD, public health CPD training. So this is one of our many workshops. We have our own website, which I guess if you've registered to come here today, you will have visited. So please do keep an eye on the website. We do send flyers out via to our stakeholders and partners. But if you go on the website, you will keep a tap on, I guess, other events and other workshops that you may want to attend.
Thank you very much indeed, and a very warm welcome to all of you. It's very nice to see so many of you here from all over the West Midlands. We really appreciate your coming to Shrewsbury, and I do apologise for the weather, which has been an awful lot better, but in a way, as we're talking about climate change, it's quite appropriate perhaps that we've got a rather dreary day to do it on. I'm Cecilia Motley. I have been a councillor for some years now, since 2003, and my present role in the new unitary council of Shropshire is as Rural Affairs Portfolio Holder. And that really has grown up because I represent a very rural division, and the problems of rural areas have become something of an obsession with me. The other particular area of concern I have is as chair of the Rural Services Network, about which I'll touch in a minute or two. But I particularly wanted to just try to bring to you a sense of what the rural areas are going through at the moment, not because I'm trying to be dreary about it or just say, you know, it's not fair, but I think that there is some misunderstanding about what happens in rural areas, and I just feel that it's quite important that we shed some light on this, and doing it within the context of climate change is actually extremely helpful. And I don't know whether any of you heard the Today programme this morning. Quite interesting this, they don't often talk about rural issues on the Today programme. They had to earlier this year when the Somerset levels completely disappeared underwater. But it was rather interesting because there was a lady complaining to John Humphreys about the lack of coverage by the BBC on rural issues, and she was calling for the reinstatement of a rural affairs correspondent, which I think would be an extremely good idea. And in the course of the interview, they played some clips of BBC's rural coverage. Inevitably, that included a scene from The Archers. Someone trying to round up his livestock in deep mud and complaining about that. Then we had a clip from the Wurzels giving a gig about cider. It was all about cider. And then, in the middle of it all, a genuinely aggrieved gentleman from the Somerset levels complaining about the fact that the rivers hadn't been dredged after the flooding earlier this year. So then John Humphreys, I think, puts his finger right on the problem, and he said, so how do we view the countryside then? Like some sort of parkland? And therein neatly encapsulates the problem that is faced by some of our most sparsely populated, and it has to be said also, some of our most beautiful rural areas, of which I count Shropshire as one. Let us now turn to the subject of today, which is climate change. And we all know, it doesn't matter whether you call it climate change or whether you just call it weather, but we all know that extreme weather events are happening, and they're happening relatively frequently. 7 years ago, the bridge which held the main road into Ludlow was swept away in torrential rain and flooding, which just literally appeared overnight. Literally, 1 minute the bridge was there, the next minute it had gone. Such was the strength of the water. The following year, the whole of Corvedale, which is my particular division, which is South Shropshire, and has a lot of small watercourses, exactly the same thing happened. We had torrential rain followed by heavy flooding, to the extent where I couldn't even get home. This came almost from nowhere as well. So we are now having to accept the fact that we are getting extreme weather at all times of the year. Nothing is neatly parcelled up anymore into winter and autumn and summer and spring. It happens when it happens, and that's it. We didn't do so badly in the West Midlands with the flooding this year. That hit the southwest and the southeast, and caused parts of Wales from coastal flooding. But that was absolutely devastating too. So how, looking now at Shropshire again, how do we cope with such events in a large, sparsely populated county when we're already labouring under a number of disadvantages, many of which are related to support, and particularly infrastructure support? I don't know whether any of you have read the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee, which last year produced a report which I can only describe as coruscating into the state of our rural areas, and concluded that they were being neglected by the government in all sorts of areas. The committee found that whilst rural employment rates are higher than urban, wages are markedly lower, the cost of living is higher, and council tax in rural authorities is consistently higher than urban authorities, but the converse is true in terms of public funding. Rural Services Network, which I mentioned before, which I chair, we have a membership of about 110 rural local authorities and the wider membership of a lot of different public services organisations. We work very hard to safeguard and improve services in rural areas and bring the results of our research to the eyes of government in as strong and emphatic a way as we possibly can. Research by Rural Services Network has uncovered the fact that there is a 50% per head disparity in government local authority settlement grant in favour of urban authorities over rural. 50% per head. And the pattern is repeated in public health, as Rod, I've no doubt, will tell you. Shropshire is easily the poorest funded authority in the West Midlands, and also in education, where Shropshire is the 5th lowest funded education authority in the country, as well as experiencing problems over the sustainability of some of its smaller schools, because, unlike the inner city areas, our birth rate is falling and continues to fall year on year. It is not set to right itself before 2017-18. On top of that, if you look again at the issues of infrastructure, we have poor transport connections, we have a rapidly ageing population. Shropshire is a county where people come to retire. Sometimes we wish they wouldn't, because of the knock-on effects, obviously, on our health services. Our health services are struggling, there is no doubt about it. Our GPs have, on the whole, have more people than they can cope with. And we also have a real problem with housing. We have a dearth of affordable housing, and that's excluding young families from the housing market. Everybody thinks that the countryside is green and beautiful, and everybody dances around and enjoys playing with sheep. Actually, we have considerable pockets of deprivation, and this particularly involves fuel poverty, because we have an awful lot of very unsuitable housing. Large stone houses, which are expensive to heat and not susceptible to cavity wall insulation and sensible precautions like that. We don't have mains gas. It's not available in the rural hinterlands. It is just about available in the market towns, but not universally. So our households have to rely on oil, which even with fuel buying schemes, which are beginning to proliferate, it's expensive. And on top of all this, and this is nearly the end of my moan, Shropshire Council has had to make £87 million worth of cuts from its discretionary budgets over the period from 2010 to 2013, and we have to find another 80 million from 2017 by 2017-18. So with a small population, a relatively low council tax base, and a lack of large businesses, this is proving quite a task. We're having to look at the way we deliver services in a completely different way. In a way, the challenge is to do it, to make a success of it. But it's tough when you don't have much to start with. However, we can't be completely subsumed by doom and gloom. And whilst we do have a few large businesses, we have a long-standing tradition of small and medium-sized businesses. We are well known for the quality of our food and our drink. We even have people making wine on the slopes of the Cllr Hill which must be absolutely astonishingly difficult to do. Our landscape is renowned and wonderful. We are the county of housemen. We have a wonderful historic environment, both built and natural, and our communities, and I really do thank them for this because I look after 10 parishes. They are remarkably self-sufficient. They fend for themselves, they cope, they look after each other, and they support each other. And also, we do benefit hugely from a multifaceted and very active voluntary and community sector. We are beginning to rely on them more and more to help us with service delivery now. So we have a lot to build on here. And I think, and I hope, that our deliberations today around this whole issue of climate change, infrastructure support, how do we build resilience into our communities, that this is actually going to help us in Shropshire, hopefully as much as it will give you ideas in your own communities as well.
Today I want to, I've been asked to talk about the sort of some of the latest findings in sort of climate change research. Obviously, this relates to not just the United Kingdom, you know, we're talking about global issues here. But obviously, I'm very much aware of local issues too. I come from a rural village in Worcestershire, not too far away, and I regularly flooded, even though I live nowhere near a river. The River Severn is several miles away, actually, in Worcester. They get flooded, but I get flooded too, nowhere near a river. And obviously, this pluvial flooding, as it's called, rather than fluvial flooding, is a problem in rural areas as well as in urban areas. So I'm very much aware of that. Also, I'd just like to back up the point that was mentioned in terms of do we get just weather or do we have climate in this country? And this is a classic exam question that we used to ask students, of course, is that we don't have climate in the UK, we only have weather. And there is some truth to that too, that we have to be prepared every day of the year. We don't get these extreme events in particular seasons. We can get flooding at any day of the year, so we have to be resilient throughout the year. Now, obviously my main, let's just move on to my first slide. I think we're lined up. Oops. Actually, the colours on here, unfortunately, are slightly, just say climate change there anyway. Obviously, I was Professor of Applied Meteorology at the University of Birmingham. I took early retirement a few years ago, and I've been working for Public Health England now part-time for the last 2.5 years. So my main role, though, is to look, I'm part of the Air Pollution and Climate Change Research Group within Public Health England. And so we're not just looking at climate change, we're also looking at air quality, which is also a problem that we're all concerned with. And I want to try and link those two together somewhat today. I want to give you a different approach to climate change rather than the sort of traditional IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change type approach, which I will mention. I also want to talk about the atmosphere and how valuable the atmosphere is and how we need to manage that, whether it's air pollution or climate change. We need to look after the atmosphere. Now, obviously, we're very much familiar with the sort of extreme weather that we're now getting. And also, you can't say with 100% certainty that the extreme weather we're getting is totally due to climate change, because we had extreme weather before our recent interest in climate change. But nevertheless, there is a detectable increase, and certainly at a local level, we're seeing that. And whether it's extreme weather, or fire, or droughts, or floods, or temperature changes, all these are having an impact on individuals who are trying to live their health and well-being, having their status rocked by these events. And that has a knock-on effect then to social and economic impacts, because obviously as these things happen, so it then knocks on to how local governments and national governments and global events actually effect on individuals as well, and affects our human health, which obviously at Public Health England is the thing that we're mostly interested in, but obviously we're interested in elements as well. My main research background is actually the impact of weather and climate on transport. The three projects I'm working on at the moment, just before we start, which I'm not going to talk about today because I'm looking at ambulance response times and how that's affected by extreme weather, and obviously climate change in the longer run too, which is an area that hasn't been looked at before. I'm also looking at air quality in terms of urban and rural areas too, particularly those erosion episodes that we had in March and April. They seem to be becoming more serious, and that obviously affects rural areas to some extent more than it does urban areas. And also I'm working on, I just came through Birmingham New Street Station today, we're looking at air quality in railway stations and the London Underground, and we're going to be looking at too, because I think that's a very important issue, which is sort of indoor problems, indoor air almost problems, indoor air quality, and also how we're very interested in how climate change and extreme weather is affecting indoor health as well as outdoor. Because these railway stations, London Underground in particular, is an enclosed environment, and the pollutants tend to build up over time. I'm sure you're all aware when you pass through New Street Station as well, it's like the London Underground. So we're very much worried about air quality and how that's monitored, or not monitored by Network Rail. So we are tackling real world issues as well as looking at the sort of global problems too. Oops. Now, what I want to talk about today very quickly really is just to give you some background into how important the atmosphere is and how we need to look after the atmosphere and how we need to manage it in a sustainable way. Now the atmosphere is extremely thin, and when you see a photograph like this you can't even see the atmosphere on there. And the atmosphere is a bit like it's been likened to the varnish on a globe. It's extremely thin and it's very difficult therefore to actually manage because it's so small. And indeed, if we brought the whole atmosphere together into one ball, it would be quite very small. If this is what we have to try and look after. But that atmosphere is vital to human life, and really the atmosphere and the services that the atmosphere provides to society are worth far more than any other resource on the planet. The atmosphere is the most valuable resource that we have, and therefore we need to look after it and manage it properly. Now, why do I say that? Why can I say that the atmosphere is worth more to society than any other resource we can think of? That's because if we took the atmosphere away, we'd all be dead in about 3 minutes, basically. We are breathing the atmosphere all the time, and we do it subconsciously, and we tend to take the atmosphere, therefore, for granted. But in fact, without the atmosphere, we couldn't do anything. And these are what the services that the atmosphere provides are vital to our health and well-being. Now, the atmosphere is very thin. It's only about 100 kilometres to virtually the atmosphere disappears. But all our weather takes place in the lowest 10 kilometres. So 10 kilometres is a very small area that we need to look after. And we know that most of it is nitrogen, oxygen, and then we have these rarer gases. But the greenhouse gases are much smaller contributions, less than 0.1% of the atmosphere. So carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide are the greenhouse gases we normally talk about. But it turns out that water vapour is the main greenhouse gas. It's not carbon dioxide at all. Water vapour is the main greenhouse gas. And as we'll see, our atmosphere acts to keep the global temperatures about 33 degrees Celsius warmer than they would otherwise be. If we took the atmosphere away, the surface temperature would be about 33 degrees colder, with about minus 15 on average. Minus 18 on average, rather. We are plus 15 at the moment on average around the world. And that is something I want to spend a little bit more time on how this works. But obviously, water vapour accounts for about half of global warming and clouds for about a quarter. So the water vapour and the clouds are about 3/4 of this 33 degrees natural global warming that we get. Obviously, what we're all worried about is what we call enhanced global warming. It's actually caused by other pollution and heat emitted, anthropogenic heat emitted, etc. And that's where carbon dioxide becomes more important, and is something that we can actually manage, we hope, into the future. Now, I haven't got time to go into this today, but basically, if we look at the services that the atmosphere provides to us for free, there's a whole range of them. Everything from the air that we breathe, which we've already mentioned, protects us from radiation and plasma from the sun and meteors. It provides this natural global warming of 33 degrees, which obviously, if the Earth's temperature was minus 18, we'd have a very different form of society than we do now. It disperses air pollution and cleanses the atmosphere naturally. It provides the hydrological cycle and converting seawater into fresh water, which we can also use. It provides for ecosystems and agriculture in terms of providing all the elements that we need for our crops. Oxygen in the atmosphere is used to combust fuel. Whenever we turn on our car engine or we have our oil central heating on, we need oxygen in the atmosphere, which we totally take for granted. So we need that for combustion of fuel. And also sound. You wouldn't be able to hear me now if it wasn't for the atmosphere actually transmitting the sound to you. The air molecules vibrating. You wouldn't have any music if there was no atmosphere. And also, of course, it provides communications and transport to get around the world. We can also use it directly for power in terms of things like wind power. And obviously, we can extract atmospheric gases. We take out gases from the atmosphere, and that's free actually. Anybody can take out atmospheric gases. You can mine the atmosphere to your heart's content. You don't need a license to do it. And obviously we're hoping that we might be able to mine carbon dioxide in the future, to actually take carbon dioxide out. But all these big companies like British Oxygen, you've probably heard of, they're extracting oxygen from the atmosphere for free and then selling it on. So anybody can do that without a license. Obviously then, the atmospheric, what we call the cultural service as well in terms of climate tourism, atmospheric recreation, the way that we use the atmosphere for ways for gliding or sailing, or we go and live on a beach somewhere. That's very important. And then finally, the aesthetic, spiritual and sensual properties of the atmosphere. Our senses, we are living in the atmosphere. We're only touching the floor with our feet. The rest of us is in the atmosphere. So our senses are all developed to use the atmosphere. So for things like not just hearing and seeing, but also smell and taste. So things like perfume, you wouldn't be able to smell them if it wasn't for the atmosphere there to transmit those molecules to the noses, as it were. But also the aesthetic side, the actual sky, and the beauty of the sky, and the constant environmental art that the sky produces every day for us. Not so great today, but beautiful skies. And so a lot of my research actually will be looking at the skies of landscape artists and how landscape artists actually portray the sky as a cultural thing too. Now one of the interesting things is a lot of talk at the moment about geoengineering of the climate, to actually put things like aerosols into the stratosphere to reflect solar radiation back into space. But that would turn the sky white. We wouldn't have blue skies anymore, so I don't think people will be very much in favour of that. So the sky that we have at the moment is fantastic, natural, environmental art, which we can appreciate on a daily basis. So this is looking at the atmosphere from a completely different point of view. We tend to think of it as a hazard. You know, we're talking about floods and droughts and tornadoes or whatever. And so in reality, though, without the atmosphere, we would be lost, completely lost. And the atmosphere is worth far more, as I say, as a resource. It provides all these services for free. And perhaps we need to take that on board in terms of looking after how, and I've said how small it is, how precious it is. As soon as we start to pollute the atmosphere, etc., obviously these services become in jeopardy. So whether it's air quality or whether it's climate change, we need to appreciate the value of the atmosphere. Now, obviously, when I'm saying we breathe in the atmosphere, this is the normal atmospheric air, as we said, is mostly nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and water vapor. But when we actually breathe in the air and then we breathe out, of course, we're converting some of that oxygen into carbon dioxide. So we're actually emitters of carbon dioxide ourselves. So we're all insiders to climate change. We produce about 1/3 of a ton of carbon dioxide each of us each year. So it's impossible to get rid of your carbon footprint entirely. Obviously, in the scheme of things, globally, nevertheless, with a huge global population of 7 billion, the amount of carbon dioxide which has been produced is actually more than all the carbon dioxide being produced by air travel, for example. So we are actually part of the problem. Not there's much we can do about that. But we are all insiders to climate change. So let's now just briefly look at the science, though, of how we're worried about climate change and how it all works. Now, the climate system, obviously, human intervention in the climate system has obviously been going on since the Industrial Revolution, which obviously you're quite responsible for in this part of the world. But that's a very small part, obviously, of the overall climate that's going on. Now, I mentioned the amount of global warming that is natural is about 33 degrees Celsius. the additional global warming caused by human activities is still quite small. It's less than 1 degree. It's only about 0.8 degrees so far across the world. But obviously, the whole of the atmosphere being warmed by just under 1 degree doesn't sound very much, but that has huge implications. And of course, what we're worried about is that's going to increase, maybe up to 5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century if we don't do something serious to protect our atmosphere. And obviously we're already committed to about 2 degrees of warming. Even if we stopped all emissions around the globe today, the extra energy that's been absorbed by the oceans would be released, and we would be warming our atmosphere by about 2 degrees. Obviously that's going to have implications too. Now, obviously, in terms of, this is the traditional thing that we worry about, the amount of incoming solar radiation and how the atmosphere is trapping longer wave radiation emitted by the Earth's surface. And this is where we talk about modelling. We can try and produce computer models, and I'm sure you've heard of lots of computer models, particularly produced by the UK Met Office, etc., to try and see what the effects are. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has just released its 5th report just at the end of 2013, and a couple of other reports coming out now. And obviously this was set up back in 1988 by the United Nations, the World Meteorological Organizations and the Environment Programme. And this is to critically assess the scientific, technical and socio-economic consequences of climate change, and to examine options for society to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to changing weather and climate. And I think we're all familiar with those sort of statements. But the problem is, of course, it's all very well talking about it and modelling it and showing that it's happening, but to convince people on the ground what the impact is likely to be and what they need to do about it is obviously something that we're all concerned with. And it's not really been effective enough. We're not actually mitigating emissions to the extent that we would like to, which is why people are now talking about geoengineering projects, etc. But if we look at the latest report from the IPCC, the colours are a bit not to worry. The main message here is this bar here. In 2011, this latest report estimated the additional radiative forcing, as we call it, caused by greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Now, what we call radiative forcing, we're talking about enhancing the amount of radiation coming in from the sun, basically. That's what we're effectively doing, and trapping that amount of energy. And this, as you can see, 1950, 1980, by 2011, we're up here, and that's over 2 watts per square metre in addition to what we're already getting from the sun. And that's obviously something that we can clearly define. And this is due to this enhanced global warming, which this is leading then to this 1 degree so far, already committed to 2 degrees. This additional radiation, we can actually then attribute that to various different greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, halocarbons, nitrous oxide, and so on. And obviously other things, some of the things are like aerosols in the atmosphere actually are reflecting more radiation back into space, so we do take that into account as well. Different changes in land use and different changes in cloud amount and so on. We can take all that into account and show that this radiative forcing is actually taking place. And we can feed that into a model. I mean, we don't have to worry about it here, but obviously people talk about the Earth, Mars and Venus, and people talk about the runaway greenhouse effect. We haven't quite got to that stage yet in terms of what's happening on Venus. But we can do the physics. This is sort of very simple physics down here. But the amount of radiation that's coming in from the sun, which is this element, sorry, that's what's emitted. This is what's the solar constant coming in from the sun. We're trapping pi r squared. If you imagine the sun in the distance, and we are a little small circle, well away from the sun, we can work out how much energy the Earth is intercepting, and we can then work out how much energy the Earth is emitting, and we can then calculate that the natural global warming is about 33 degrees, and enhanced global warming is about 0.8 degrees today so far. But by 2050, that could be as high as 3 degrees, so suddenly this thing could take off. On Venus, the amount of global warming is about, natural global warming is about 458 degrees. and obviously their atmosphere is mostly made up of carbon dioxide. We're not going to go into that sort of level, but this is just the simple way that we can actually model and look at the changes in the atmospheric composition and how that's going to affect the equilibrium surface temperatures on Earth. Now, we can also model backwards in time, and we can compare that to observations. We know that in reality we've had about 10 ice ages in the last 2 billion years. That naturally our climate, we should actually be in an ice age now. We've had our interglacial from the last ice age, which lasted about 10,000 years. And that's about as far as it would normally last in these 10 ice ages that we've had before. So when I was at school, we were all taught that we were heading for the next ice age. In fact, I remember doing a civil service entry exam where I had to write an essay on how we would control the ice age as it moved in from Scotland down over England. So the science, obviously, if you look at the sheer physics of things, we should be getting colder. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes too. In fact, the enhanced global warming that we're getting is overweight. And if we go back just over 1,000 years, back into the medieval times, obviously we had a medieval warming period, and then we had the Little Ice Age, as it was called, between about 1600 and up to 1900 and so on, and then we've had this warming since then. But naturally, we should be getting colder, and obviously this sharp rise in temperature since the Little Ice Age is way beyond what we've had before. And if we do the physics again, this is what is causing. Now, of course, we've had various theories that it's something to do with the sun, the changing amount of radiation coming from the sun, or is it due to volcanic activity, or is it due to human activity and air pollution in the atmosphere that's causing this rise in temperature. Now, this is when I was at school in the 60s, when temperatures appeared to be dipping, and we were all saying, right, heading for the next ice age. And then, of course, since then, we've had this warming, and obviously that's been related to increases in carbon dioxide. Now, the question is, can we model all these different elements? And if we look at the measurements, this is at Mauna Loa in Hawaii. You can see that the parts per million of carbon dioxide is still rising, despite all the efforts that we've made around the globe to try and mitigate levels. The reason this site is chosen is the background site in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, well away from any industry. So this is a very good site to represent what the background levels of greenhouse gases are in the atmosphere. Levels have just reached 400 parts per million, and the background level at pre-industrial times was about 280. So there's no sign yet of any reduction in carbon dioxide levels. There are seasonal variations because the northern hemisphere is much bigger land mass than the southern hemisphere. That's why we get sort of rhythm. But the black line there gives you the trend. And if we look at the trend since observations were begun, there's still no sign of any reduction of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So mitigation is not having any impact as yet on background levels of carbon dioxide in this case. So obviously we can monitor these other effects in terms of, is it carbon dioxide increases, or is it solar cycle variations, or is it volcanic eruptions, big volcanic eruptions down here. If we put that into our models, if we actually look at this bottom one here, just natural forcings only, i.e. volcanic activity, and what's called the Milankovitch cycle, the distance of the Earth from the Sun, which is causing these ice ages that we've had in the past. And these are the black line there is the sort of observations of global temperature. The blue line here is what would be happening if there weren't greenhouse gases being emitted, anthropogenic greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And you can see that theoretically there would be a cooling going on, so we would be heading for the next ice age. But there's so much now in the atmosphere that in fact, when we put the greenhouse gases and other effects, as we've already seen, and solar cycle variations are in here, but these natural cycles are in here as well, then we find there's a very good fit. That in fact we're offsetting that natural return to ice age conditions, and in fact we're getting much warmer as we're familiar with. So obviously that's something that we know about. Also, this warming is not uniform across the globe. There are some areas, here's the United Kingdom here, There are some areas that are getting slightly cooler, like here in the Atlantic. And there are other areas that are getting particularly warm as well. But on average, over that period, then obviously we have got this warming of about 0.8 degrees so far. But there is spatial variation depending on where you live on the planet. And if you live in Birmingham, these are our observations from our weather station at the University of Birmingham. Then again, we've had this warming period where the mean temperature in Birmingham used to be about 9.5 degrees, and now we're up into the 10.5 degrees. So we've had about, with about average in this part of the world, we've had about 1 degrees warmer on average temperatures. And the Birmingham pattern is very similar to Central England temperatures, which you've probably heard about the CET, which is obviously showing this warming too. And if we look at the CET temperatures, we found that the number of days per year when the Central England temperature is falling below 0 has gone down over time since the 1770s when the Central England temperature was first arrived, even though we've had a couple of cold winters recently. And the number of days when the temperature is above 20 degrees has obviously climbed. So obviously the measurements are confirming that this is happening, confirming the models. Now obviously the models, we can then predict the future, into the future, and there are all sorts of models around the world, all different models, and of course they're encouraged to run their own models because we could then independently compare them, etc. Different parts of the world. The Hadley Centre is the UK Met Office model here, and you can see that predictions now up to the end of the century here vary between 2 degrees up to 5 degrees on different models. Some are even higher. These are sort of the more respectable models. And in fact, it's fairly clear that we're at the top end of most of these predictions at the moment in terms of how the temperature is increasing. So what can we do about it? This is the, can we as individuals do something to prevent this global phenomenon? And obviously the question is, as individuals, we could all try. But basically, in the United Kingdom, we produce less than 2% of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. So even if we stopped everything in the UK, it wouldn't have any impact at all on what's going on in the rest of the world with China and the US and other developing countries. Obviously, they're still expanding the amount of greenhouse gases they emit. So in some ways, what we want to educate our kids to do is to be ambassadors. We have to go away and persuade the rest of the world to reduce their emissions, as well as ourselves. And of course, we set a good example. We're saying we're going to reduce our emissions by 80% by 2050. So we can go out there and say, we're doing this, but that's not going to stall global temperatures. You need to do the same. And this is what was hoped in Copenhagen not that long ago. We were hoping to get everyone to sign up to this 80% reduction in emissions by 2050, but of course it didn't happen. And they're still trying again now to persuade them to do the same by 2020 now. Are we missing a windows of opportunity? Because while what was it? We fiddle, Rome burns, whatever it is. Because what's happening? We've got glacial retreat. We've got sea ice reductions in both the Arctic and the Antarctic. Sea ice is retreating at a very fast rate. And you can see here in recent years it's gone way beyond into in the Arctic here. Much lower sea ice now than we've ever had. And I was the lead author on this climate change risk assessment on transport, because one of the things we were looking at is how very soon we'll be able to sail through the Arctic, if it's allowed. And the routes from the Far East, which currently come through the Suez Canal, through the Mediterranean to reach Western Europe, will be considerably shortened if we can actually go through the Arctic. That's, obviously there are some benefits as well as problems accrued from that. And obviously sea level rise, the seas, there's a big increase in sea level rise, although obviously there's quite a bit of fluctuation, but that's not uniform across the globe. Again, that varies in different parts of the globe. So we can model that, confirm it with measurements. And then obviously we talked about the links then into extreme weather. And this is information which is produced by insurance company Munich Re, and they look globally all the incidents of extreme weather, how many people have been killed, how much property has been destroyed, etc. Here's Hurricane Katrina in 2005 there. Huge losses to the economy. And this is that's the total cost of these events, and that's the insured cost. So you can see that half of that cost wasn't insured. And in fact, most of these events, because they're happening in developing countries as well, there's no insurance, but you can see that the levels are increasing. Now, we produced a report, Public Health England, on the health effects of this climate change, currently and into the future as well, which you can obviously have a look at. Looking at the evidence, we made a series of recommendations and identified a number of research gaps which we're now trying to fill. And finally, I just want to show you one piece of evidence now that we're looking at ambulance response times. I said that going down from the global to the practical now. How can we actually use this sort of information as well to improve public health and well-being? Now, one of the things that with ambulances, there are more than 9 million emergency 999 calls in England a year. And that's something like 25,000 ambulance calls a day around the UK. So we're looking to see whether we can use that information as a snapshot of the nation's health by identifying each ambulance call has to have an illness code attached to it. And we can see whether or not we could use this in real time to have a snapshot to identify what's happening. And obviously that's something that we're looking at. So you might wonder how ambulance calls are affected by the weather. Well, the normal, we normally expect 75% of ambulance call-outs to reach the destination of the patient within 8 minutes, which is quite a tough call, particularly in rural areas, to try and get there within 8 minutes. But normally when the temperature is sort of above about 5 degrees here and below about 20 degrees, then this is for London, they are achieving that target quite easily. When the temperature drops below or raises above 20 degrees, then the response time goes down. And obviously, if we're going to have more warmer temperatures and more severe cold weather, then what we need to do is to somehow help the ambulance service to pull that up, because obviously if they can't get to the patients in the same sort of time, then there's going to be a problem. So we are looking at how the evidence, we're actually gathering evidence now to look at practical examples rather than just worrying about the global issues. So I'll finish there and hope it's some food for thought and hope to chat to somebody later.
I was asked by the Environment Agency and URS Consulting to help with this document. So this is a document produced to help, particularly health and wellbeing boards, but the wider health and social care economy, to adapt to climate change. So Professor Thorns has gone through some of the issues with climate change, and the two main reactions are to mitigate, which obviously is to reduce your CO2 emissions, or to adapt to the changes in the environment. And even if we close all the factories on the whole of the Earth, the temperature will still increase in the future because there's so much carbon dioxide locked into the system, into the oceans. So we have to adapt anyway, so that's not, it's not an option just to focus on mitigation. So this document is focusing on how local areas can adapt to climate change. So this is a vision to create a society which makes timely, far-sighted, well-informed decisions to address the risks and opportunities posed by a changing climate. Hopefully you'll know some of these events anyway. So we had the Stern report back in 2006, which was looking at the economic case for mitigation and adaptation to climate change, showing that it's far more cost effective to do something now than wait for the effects of climate change in the future. And the longer we wait, the more expensive it will become. We've already had mention made of the financial pressures on all organisations currently, but in a way, climate change, with the financial pressures, would increase the need to do something about climate change, not decrease the need. We've got the Climate Change Act, so the UK government have set the target of reducing CO2 emissions by 80% by 2050. We've got the Climate Change Risk Assessment, this CCRA process that Professor Thorns mentioned, and there'll be another one every 5 years. and the National Adaptation Programme, because we need to adapt whatever we do around mitigation. We're going to have to adapt to the changing climate anyway. There's this report, which is part of the Environment Agency's response to the National Adaptation Programme, and then there'll be a report on the progress of that in 2015. So this is part of a climate-ready basket of services that the Environment Agency are leading on. That was launched in 2012, and that has a number of themes. One of the themes is the Healthy and Resilient Communities theme, which again this document is one of the elements of. So hopefully you'll know about the reorganisation of the healthcare system, and there are lots of opportunities here. So for example, you've got potentially greater public involvement through Health Watch and Local Health Watch, and you've got organisations like the Health and Wellbeing Board, which is central to the new health economy, and you have all the organisations feeding into that Health and Wellbeing Board, and that's why we've focused a lot of the recommendations of this report about how to influence that whole process. You'll have a data gathering system, so you've got the JSNA, the Joint Strategic Needs Assessment, being produced, gathering all the information around the locality and the needs of that locality, and then that's informing the health and wellbeing strategies for the locality, which is all being led by the Health and Wellbeing Board. So again, Professor Thorne's mentioned this. This is produced by the Health Protection Agency, which is now Public Health England. This is looking at the health effects of climate change. So we've already done a lot of work trying to quantify the impacts of climate change on the health of the population. A number of chapters there looking at temperature, air pollution, indoor air quality, and other issues as well. Obviously, this is looking at that they're not new impacts on health. It's looking at how climate change is affecting existing impacts on health. So again, it was already mentioned about air quality and how this is impacted on health. So at the moment, there's about 30,000 hospital admissions due to ozone. So even at a local authority level, you're talking about large numbers. If you're looking at excess winter mortality, again, you've got about 30,000 people dying every year from excess winter mortality. And then excess summer mortality. Back in 2003, we had the heat wave, where there's about 15,000 people who died in France due to that heat wave, and people in England also in 2003, 2006. And the West Midlands, when they tried to quantify some of the impacts there, the West Midlands is one of the regions mostly affected because we're a landlocked region, so obviously we don't have the mitigating effect of the coast on our temperatures. So the aims of this document, looking at how climate change and adaptation can enhance health and well-being, providing some of the tools to the health and well-being boards to take action, emphasising this need for urgency, and looking in particular as well about health inequalities. So obviously health inequalities is one of the, and mental health as well, one of the priorities for a large number of health and well-being boards. And obviously climate change will have a big impact on how the health inequalities in an area. So there's three sections to this document. The first section is the getting ready section, which gives you some background information around climate change and some of the health impacts there. The second is some enabling action, giving you ideas about what you can do, and that's broken down by specific roles. And then at the end, there's a sort of resource section where there's a number of tools and other resources for how to carry out adaptation in your area. So in the first section, we started off with the significant 7. So we looked at 5 of the major impacts of climate change on the health and well-being of the population, and then gave some examples of adaptation exercises that can be carried out. So you've got the impact of heat on, well, you've got the numbers there of deaths, so 15,000 in France back in 2003, but obviously that's going to be the tip of the iceberg. So for every person that dies, there'll be a larger number of people who are affected in their the mortality, the morbidity in the population being affected. And other things, so skin cancer, pressure on the healthcare providers, so the resilience in the system, and obviously the impact there on health inequalities. And then we've looked at how different elements that feed into the Health and Wellbeing Board will be affected. And obviously for a lot of these adaptation policies, they'll have multiple benefits across a number of organisations, but for them to be successfully put into place, you'll need a large number of organisations to work together to be enabled for those policies to be implemented. And we've also looked at the different climate change impacts in different parts of the country. So for example, in urban areas, you'll have the urban heat island effect. So in the centre of large cities, temperature on a given day might be 2, 3, 4 degrees hotter than in the countryside outside that city. And you may want to focus, for example, on air pollution in urban centres. So there's the impact of mitigation measures on air pollution in a city, but also the impact of temperature itself will change air pollution levels in the city. In rural areas, you may want to focus on, for example, the impacts on drought and how that impacts on the local economy. And obviously coastal, you have coastal erosion and coastal flooding. So there's a big issue with vulnerability, and here's a quote: vulnerable groups, including people facing poverty and disadvantage, and agencies working with the groups, should be at the centre of developing climate change adaptation strategies. But at the moment, voluntary and community organisations are not involved to a large degree in local adaptation planning. There's a big issue around social justice and climate change. And the sort of vulnerable groups which will be affected by climate change more than other groups. You've got the usual groups that are always often more affected by these issues, like the elderly and the young infants. And then also disadvantaged groups, the homeless people. But also you have other groups specific to climate change. So for example, you've got here tourists, people attending mass gatherings, and people living in south-facing top 4 floor flats. So there's also the economic argument made. So we mentioned earlier the Stern report and the impact on global gross domestic product and how that's going to increase in the future. We did a mini Stern report for Birmingham, looking at the actions we could take. And it shows that there's still a lot of the low-hanging fruit that you could take. There's lots of actions we could take at the moment that would have zero cost. So as adaptation policies develop, they'll get more and more expensive. At the moment, there are lots of very cheap options that we could undertake, which actually benefit the economy as well as the environment. And in the second part of the document, there are a number of tables where we've gone through different organisations and we've looked at what they could do and the sort of questions they could be asking their health and wellbeing boards and other partners in the health economy. So, for example, we've got here health and wellbeing board members and members of the clinical commissioning groups, and we're preparing for emergencies. So we could be asking the health and wellbeing groups, have we been gathering information on emergency response systems for severe weather and public health outbreaks? And then we've listed there as well the benefits to the health of the population by carrying out some of those actions. And the final part of the document, there are some tools and other resources to use. So, for example, this is a tool looking at the JSNA, so checklist you can go through, having a look at the joint strategic needs assessment in your locality. And these should be changing anyway because government guidance is suggesting that JSNA should be more forward-looking, planning further into the future and trying to predict some of the impacts rather than just looking at historical impacts. So here you could be asking, is your JSNA planning not just describing what the situation is now or historically has been, is it planning into the medium and long term, looking at what's going to happen in 10, 20 years time, looking at the population, looking at the temperature, has it considered flooding? And this has been used in a number of local authorities at the moment. They found this quite useful, and I think a lot of existing JSNAs haven't ticked lots of yeses on that checklist at the moment. So hopefully that will improve in the future. And then at the end of the document, there's a number of sector-specific resources. So for example, here you've got 4 clinical commissioning groups, and then the key message that members of that organisation can make to their leaders, the chair of the CCG, and then some of the guidance that's out there to help them make that case for why you should be looking at climate change adaptation. So for example, links to the public health outcome framework and how action on adaptation could influence some of those indicators.
Good morning, and delighted to bring you to Shropshire. Apologies that we haven't given you the weather we've had for the last week or so. But it does kind of illustrate the point that John was making earlier on about Britain having a weather and not a climate. What I want to try and do in this session is focus very much more on the practical elements of it, partly in my role as Director of Public Health, but mainly for us as a local community, and what that might mean for us in terms of dealing with climate change. What I don't want to do is steal the thunder of my colleagues who are doing the workshops this afternoon. My emergency planning colleagues have already told me off for borrowing some of their slides. So I'm not going to go into the depths of emergency planning, but I do want to touch on some of the things which will make an impact for us. And the image that's up there of rural Shropshire is great. We have an idyllic setting. It is absolutely stunning county to work in. And I'm mindful, having worked for many years in places like Glasgow and Liverpool, Manchester, that how lucky I am now to be Director of Public Health here. But it gives me a completely different set of public health challenges in comparison to working in inner cities. And in relation to climate change, it's clear that the growing consensus is climate change is happening. The element is, what's the effect going to be on rural communities? I want to go through a mixture of scenarios with you, and I want to touch on them and get you to think about them, particularly in the workshops, in terms of those issues that will affect individuals, those issues that will affect communities, because they are critical to us. In part because of the population that we're seeing in rural areas, and Cecilia alluded to it, but this issue of we have an ageing community in comparison to the rest of the country, and many of the rural areas do. My view on that is actually for the vast majority of issues, that's actually a significant advantage, because we have got lots of very able people who are skill-rich, time-rich, and who are giving a significant amount of their time to supporting their local community. So in terms of the points being made on community resilience, I would like to see them as an asset, but the challenge from public health terms is actually we've got a number of people who have long-term conditions which could be affected significantly by extremes of weather, and particularly if those extremes of weather last for longer periods of time than we've been used to in the UK. I love these things where we set your time. So in terms of individuals, we're touching on things such as the effects of weather themselves, but also want to keep in mind issues around employment and employment opportunity, because that will be affected by the weather, particularly for local authorities where we have a situation where with our reduced budgets, subsidising local transport will be difficult. So people relying on their own transport, relying on jobs that are within their immediate area, could be significantly affected by the effects of climate change, and I'll touch on reasons why. But also in terms of isolation. One of the great things about living in a rural area is that You are not in London or Manchester where you feel that people are on top of you. But if some of the effects of weather for us mean that increases the isolation, then that potentially is a problem for us. For communities, it's multiplied. As we've seen in the recent flooding here in the county, but also for areas in other parts of the country. You're trying to go to severe weather. Yeah, you're trying to tell us something about severe weather. The effects of flooding, the effects of snow, effects of ice, and indeed the effects of heat, which I'll touch on, will have a significant effect on isolating communities, in making them feel more isolated because they don't feel that they can either go out within their own town or within their own village for fear of falling, or for fear of the other factors that are around there, such as if you're suffering from asthma, the effects of severe weather change can make you feel less confident about your ability to function. But because so much of our community is influenced directly and indirectly by jobs in the farming environment and rural affairs, weather is a significant factor for it. Whether it's the asparagus farmers that we have here, whether it's the vineyard that you mentioned on the Cllr Hills, or the one just down the road in Wroxeter, or some of the other associated farming that's going on. I mean, as we saw in Wales not so long ago, the effect of the severe snow on livestock, particularly sheep, was significant. So the impact on rural businesses of climate change could be quite significant. And linked to that, clearly, for me as the lead for infection prevention and control, is that changes in climate overall may mean that infections, which we saw only rarely, become much more common. A few weeks ago, we were looking at the impact of weather. Now, what I want to highlight with this is not so much the detail that's in there, but it was the focus for much of the country was on flooding. But actually, flooding wasn't the main problem for us here in Shropshire. It was the wind. It was the fact that the wind caused trees to come down, it damaged infrastructure, it took roofs off buildings, whether they be houses or schools. But most impact was actually the disruption to the power lines. And we had significant disruption because of those power lines coming down, the difficulty of the power companies trying to get into areas to repair those power lines, and for significant periods of time, individuals and communities being disadvantaged by having no power at all. And for the point that Cecilia was making earlier on, and indeed Paul, that for communities where you have poorly insulated houses, where you have higher risks of death through cold weather, that significant loss of power for that extended period of time was difficult. Understandably, power companies focused on those communities where they could make most of their customers back online in the shortest period of time possible. But one of the disadvantages of that would mean that many of our rural communities had a longer period of time without power in its entirety. But the other link for us in terms of emergency planning was, how did we identify those individuals who were isolated, who were without power or without resource, or indeed because of the combination of trees being down blocking local roads, flooding affecting the road infrastructure as well, that they couldn't get access to key supplies. Now, whether that would be food, or whether it was medicines, or indeed visits from health or social care staff. For us, it's actually looking not just at what we would see as the obvious ones like snow and ice and flooding. It is actually taking into account that if we are getting significant changes in other weather conditions, then we'll see more of this. And as my colleagues in emergency planning and I have been dealing with over the last couple of weeks, the impact for us of just a serious road traffic accident, a collision which takes a major roundabout on the bypass there, can lead to a major disruption in our road network with 14 miles worth of queues. Now, it's bad enough dealing with it on a sunny day, but actually if we're dealing with climate change on a significant level, disruptions such as these will cause us some real problems. Some of the measures that have been put in place to try and deal with flooding are working. We were very fortunate that the flood barriers in Shrewsbury, the ones down in Ironbridge work very well. What we are seeing though is that this change in the climate is actually affecting us, one of our highest risk ratings. This is, I love it. This is good. It's trying to tell me two things. Move on. And the other one is it's trying to tell me that we are looking at two interlinked issues about our history. What you've got there, though it's difficult to tell, is actually a castle wall. It's Ludlow Castle Wall, a beautiful historic building. But we've had significant problems with it trying to fall down. But we also have one of our highest risk ratings for emergency planning is Ironbridge Gorge. So UNESCO site, a great area of scientific and natural beauty, birth of the Industrial Revolution, arguably. However, for us, that gorge represents one of our highest risks in terms of it collapsing. And the risk of it collapsing is linked very much to this issue of lots of rain and then drying out. And these keep constant changes. So there's a lot of remedial work that's going on at the moment, but the challenge for us of doing that is exemplified by what's going on at the moment. There's been a massive hole in one of the roads over in our neighbouring area of Telford-on-Wrekin. And it's almost like that classic joke of the police have noticed that there is a large hole in the M6 and police are looking into it. Well, it's taken them 6 months to actually get the work underway because the nature of the geology that's around it makes it an incredibly difficult task to fill in that hole and do it in a way that will actually be sustainable and allow that road to be usable again. For us, this is a significant risk, so weather watching has become quite significant because if we're seeing these changes in weather conditions, that gorge will collapse, we will get a dam being created and we'll get flooding in a very different pattern from the ones we would normally expect. But what we're also seeing is, again, because of the kind of freeze-thaw effect and the way it's occurring, is that buildings that have been standing for 800 plus years are now being affected by it. And that has significant implications for communities, in this case because of the houses that are right next to it. So planning for climate change in the way that Paul was highlighting, for us needs to take into quite a diverse range of issues, from 1,000-year-old castles right the way through to the heart of the Industrial Revolution. I did some work a few years ago with colleagues in the States who regularly get hurricanes, tornadoes, whatever else, and it was interesting to share with our colleagues in terms of the kind of planning that they take into account on a regular basis. So the hospitals there, the equivalent of the one that we're in here, have alpha team and beta team, and if it's hurricane season and it happens to be your turn to be on, the alpha team basically beds down in the hospital, their families come into protected environments, and beta team, well, you're lucky, you're going to be going off with the rest of the evacuees to get out of the way of the storms, and the alpha team will be ensconced in the hospital and working right the way through, reassured that their families are protected. We've been lucky in the UK. We haven't had those extremes of weather conditions. But the downside of that is that we don't plan for them in the way that the Americans or many of our other colleagues, Sherry, one of the emergency planning officers who work for us, is Canadian, and therefore the communities there recognise that it will take a significant amount of time for their for their government to be able to do things for them, and therefore much more is done in terms of community resilience to enable people to survive for a longer period of time. And for us, the challenge is how do we build in that kind of thinking without going over the top. What we're seeing particularly now is these kind of feast and famine of periods of where we're absolutely flooded to those issues where we are in drought, and with drought, the risks of fires in our fantastic rural areas that we've got, and the pressures that it will put on our fire service will be significant. But it's not just in those kind of forest and brush fires. As we saw a few years ago, there are particular implications for us in terms of the industrial units that were around. Kingpin was a Kingpin is a facility that stored a large amount of used tyres. Heat, we think, was one of the factors that caused that fire to start. Putting out one of these fires is a significant problem. My fire service colleagues will attest to the difficulty that caused us. So it's not just thinking about brush fires, it is actually thinking about how extremes of weather can have an effect on industrial complexes as well. And it's not just the big Flicksburg-style disaster. In terms of infectious disease, clearly we've been anticipating a form of either bird flu or swine flu, which would have a significant effect on the community. But what I wanted to highlight was more the changing pattern of our climate, meaning that illnesses like blue tongue and West Nile virus are likely to become more common because the climate conditions would be much more conducive to those occurring. And that has a number of effects. I mean, firstly, as you can see from this map, what the US is showing is that areas that weren't previously affected by West Nile virus are now becoming more common. One of the elements for me as a blood donor is that the range of questions I now get compared to a few years ago when well, actually quite a few years ago when I started to be a blood donor, about where have I been in the world? What exposure have I had to particular conditions? Well, actually, whereas at the moment, that wouldn't be an issue for me if I'm only in the UK. Potentially, we can see the situation as climate change occurs, that illnesses such as West Nile virus become something which are endemic to this country. We've seen in the example of animal health, the changing pattern that's occurred with blue tongue disease. And that's affected our farmers, and certainly our farmers have been watching the kind of spread of that from the Kent, East Anglia coastline up to ourselves. And that kind of changing pattern is something that we have to take into account, especially within rural communities, because it can devastate communities, as the next slide keeps trying to tell me, which is foot and mouth. Though foot and mouth has been a problem for us off and on for many years. What I have to think of, what my colleagues have to think of in animal health and in related departments, is that those changes could become more common, so that rather than it being a sporadic outbreak, it could well be the pattern for the future. And therefore our planning needs to take that into account. What our planning also needs to take into account is that because we're rural, communication systems are not as good as they are in many of the urban areas, as our rural communities will tell you, and hence why this sign of the telephone is that actually many of our communities, particularly in the southwestern area along the Welsh border, have no access to broadband at all, and whilst as a council we're hoping to try and ensure that we've got effective broadband coverage by 2016, the investment required to do that is significant. And though we've got, I think it's about 11.5 million promised to us to try and roll out broadband to the whole of the county, we have to match that with another 11.5 million at a time when we're having to find, as Cecilia was highlighting, 40 million this year of savings and another 40 million of savings over the next 2 years. So for local authorities in rural areas to invest in the kind of things that would make a difference, and we do things that would reduce the isolation of communities, allow us to be able to contact communities and be clear whether communities are at risk or individuals are at risk, this is a significant challenge. So that combination of disruption to the roads, disruption to the communication networks, has to be built into our thinking at a time when actually ourselves and our other statutory sector colleagues are facing significant cuts. Our police service, our fire and rescue service. So for us, it is a real headache. Cecilia alluded to this report, the 24th of July last year, highlighting that for rural communities, because we have so many people who are older, who have got a mixture of long-term conditions, and who are living in isolated settings, the challenge of us providing high-quality care on a continuing basis will be a significant challenge. And part of that will be how we help communities to help themselves, how we work with voluntary sector organisations to develop that resilience, and in time of extreme need, have the kind of support network which means that people will be good neighbours and will be good neighbours on a sustained basis. I mean, the data that's there in terms of the ageing population, though in the UK it's going up by 18.1%, we're significantly higher than that, particularly compared to England and Wales overall. We did a rural health survey last year, and this is a limited selection of it. What it's highlighting is that in terms of people being worried, amongst the things that they're worried about are the effects of climate. Flooding, unseasonal cold weather, indeed linked in that was unseasonable hot weather, because for many of the crops that our communities are growing, they require ideally certain patterns of heat, rain, whatever, and when those are disrupted, the quality of the crop is disrupted quite significantly. And so what we're seeing, and this has an effect on self-harm, and not just in adults, but self-harm in children, is patterns of mental health which are affected quite significantly by how good or how bad the weather is. And that's much more a factor, I would argue, in rural communities than it is in urban communities. I'm not just talking about seasonal affective disorder, I'm talking about your lifestyle being significantly affected by the quality of the weather. And that links to this issue of feeling out of control. The effects of climate change across the world mean that the beef prices, milk prices, whatever, are affected adversely. It could work in favour of some of our producers, but only if they're able to produce the crops. And consequently, within our farming community, and those individuals whose livelihood depend on being in support of the farming community, so people who do things like provide fencing supplies or provide some of the support activities such as the vets, could be significantly affected as well by those changes. So, to conclude on this, whilst climate change in theory could have some benefits for our community, overall, because of the uncertainty of the weather, because of the likelihood that of sustained periods of difficult weather, whether that's be too hot, too cold, too wet, too icy, too snowy, the rurality of our communities, the isolation of our communities, are likely to be at significant risk. Because we have an ageing population, because they are a greater distance from their family network, if we do get significant periods of poor weather, then that isolation could increase. And therefore we can see some of the effects that are alluded to in both John and Paul's presentation. But critically for us, at a time as a council, and indeed most rural councils are poorly funded in comparison to their urban neighbours, this means that our ability to do things that will mitigate those effects will be incredibly difficult. Trying to free up those resources when we're trying to sustain services and making significant cuts at the same time will be difficult. I think to conclude, and going into the sections that are there, there is an element about how we work smarter. But as a public health clinician, the element for me is always how do you prevent the problem? How do you get upstream of that issue? How do you put the things in place that will make that significant difference? Some of that is what we as individuals can do for ourselves, some will be what we can do as families. But essentially for a rural area like this, and Cecilia alluded to it, is how do we enable communities to become even more resilient than they are already, and to use the resources that we've got to best effect.
So here we are. When you ask a question, if you'd be kind enough just to give your name, that would be very helpful. So can we kick off? First question, please.
Question to Professor Thorne. We seem in this country, and perhaps particularly in Shropshire, to be reluctant to accept that part of this resilience needs to be local energy supplies. We rely upon the grid very heavily, and yet whenever there is a movement within a community to improve the local energy supply by wind farm, solar panel farm, there is immediately an outcry. And that seems a shame, because I don't think it's people thinking far enough ahead. John?
I agree with you, and it still amazes me how things like solar panel installation isn't part of building regulations. I came on the train today and saw all these new houses just being completed, and there's no sign of a solar panel anywhere. I think this would be embedded now within local policy. But yeah, there's still, I guess, problems in identifying this problem of having to spend money up front, whether it's for a household or whether it's for a local authority or co-pacs, etc. And or whether it's government, there just seems to be this reluctance. They're so worried about the next few years in terms of political decisions and stuff. They don't see the longer-term view. That these things are very sensible investments. I've just had solar panels installed on my house. I can't believe how much electricity I'm generating. It's fantastic. And I've generated more than I'm using, which I can't believe. And it's such a sensible thing. It's taken me years before to take the plunge, as it were, until the prices came down and I thought, oh, this is an economic view. But yeah, I think we do need to go down much more the local route. But one of the things, obviously, that's annoying me at the moment is the whole issue of fracking. I mean, I'm not sure whether that's problem in Shropshire, perhaps it's more further north, where they're talking about North Shropshire. And this is something I'm dead against, but the government seems to be all in favour of, because they're hoping that energy prices are going to come down and this is going to please the population. But in reality, of course, from a longer term viewpoint, it's terrible, because you're releasing all these gases into the atmosphere. And all this all this fracking in America has brought down prices, but that's why America is now selling its coal elsewhere, cheap coal elsewhere, so it's actually adding to the problem. So people always seem to take a short-term view, and I agree that we need to take a much longer view on these things.
Just as an illustration of that, we've just seen a local planning application for some houses, and as you have said, nothing about solar panels, especially on those houses that have a south-facing roof. However, there has to be a 13-amp external socket, just in case they have an electric car.
Oh, right.
Thank you. Question number 2. Right, hold on, we've got, yes, Miranda, I can see you first.
Thank you. It's a question for Miranda Ashwell, Shropshire Public Health. A question for Paul Fisher. You're under the weather document, sounds fascinating, and I'm going to have a look at it. I just wondered if you'd factored into that how we manage our natural environment as a mitigating factor. And obviously from an LNP point of view, the role that they have in being able to contribute towards mitigating. Because obviously, you know, the way we use our natural environment, the trees we plant or we don't plant, has an impact on flooding, for example.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, that's mentioned in the document.
Great.
You go to the Marmot review, it mentions there about bringing in more green space. I think one of the issues with adaptation policies, it's so complicated and such a wide web of impacts and benefits of different organisations. So if you're looking at mitigation, you can say, well, if we do this, we can reduce our carbon emissions by X amount, and it's easier to see that, you know, that scientific engineering solution to the problem. Whereas I think sometimes with adaptation, you can put in your green space, and that could have those multiple benefits on flooding, CO2, local air quality, mental health, physical activity, social cohesion. So there's 1,001 different things that could impact if you started planting, you know, lots more trees in the area. But then those impacts fall on a number of different agencies, on a number of different parts of the community. So it's quite difficult then to quantify all of that. But certainly, yeah, those sort of issues will have a key role to play in adaptation.
I was particularly thinking of the relationship between Health and Wellbeing Board, the LEP, LNP. You know, they all have a role to play in this agenda. It's how you know, the recommendations and the resources to join those up against.
I'm mindful that we've just used a number of acronyms.
Sorry.
Local Nature Partnership.
Yes.
Local Economic Partnership.
Yes.
Were there any others that we mentioned?
Health and Wellbeing Board was the one we mentioned. I apologise.
I might just add to that, actually. I chair the Shropshire and Telford Local Nature Partnership, and we are having discussions at the moment about just that, Miranda, this issue of how you avoid soil runoff, which inevitably then leads to more fertilisers having to be put on land, which has obviously implications for water quality. If there's a lot of phosphate runoff, you get flooding incidents, and therefore your fields are all washed off. I think it's fair to say, because I also have regular meetings with our national farming, the NFU and the CLA, that is the Country Landowners and the National Farmers Union, that there is increasing recognition of the need to try and mitigate, and actually not just mitigate these events, but also try and anticipate them by doing things like planting more trees. The problem is that when you talk to a farmer about planting more trees on what could be productive land, he doesn't terribly like the idea. So one of the things that we're trying to encourage is actually the digging out of swales at the end of fields, which are sort of big dips into which, if you're going to get topsoil runoff, you can actually, the topsoil will collect there, and it can then be restored back to the field later. We're beginning to make a little bit of progress with this, but one of the other activities of the Local Nature Partnership in particular is to work closely with the Local Enterprise Partnership, which has a very strong imperative about economic growth and economic delivery. The Local Nature Partnership is very aware of the potential impacts of a lot of economic growth on natural habitats, on the environment in general, and wants to work with the local enterprise partnerships to see whether between us we can mitigate those to a certain extent. So the role of the local nature partnerships is, I think, growing in importance, having had a rather difficult start, mainly because there's no funding for them. And I think they're beginning to pick up now, and there is a general realisation that local enterprise partnerships in their economic delivery role need to work very closely with the local nature partnership. So this is ongoing.
Hi, thank you. Alan Carr from Sustainability West Midlands, no relation to the comedian you may have heard of. Just to mention really, it's a question for everybody and also a question for people in the audience as well, to be honest. We're in the process of developing a network for health professionals, like many people in the room today, that focuses specifically on climate change adaptation. So we're looking at bringing together West Midlands health organisations to actually talk about this, share their experiences, share learning, set up events and so on. Some of the events we'll be looking at later in the year will be on community resilience and incorporating climate change and adaptation into JSNA's health and wellbeing boards, etc. From your experiences, do you think that is something that is going to be welcome, and is there appetite for that, do you think?
Can we all answer that? And let's start with Rob.
The short answer is yes. The longer answer to that links to some work that we were doing with elected members from town and parish councils some weeks ago, where we were picking up on different aspects of emergency planning, community resilience, and the kind of things that you were highlighting that they were picking up from their experiences locally, and in many of the communities they were already well established in the types of things that would enable community resilience to occur. But also the recent events, because this session we did with town and parish councillors occurred just after the February storms, it focused their attention on what resilience needed to be and how they, in particular those, but their communities could take better responsibility for looking after themselves. So yes, it would be used.
Thanks.
Yes, certainly. I mean, there's lots of good practice across the region. So yeah, I mean, it's a great opportunity there to share practice across the region, learn from each other. All of these issues are cross-cutting, so you need a multi-agency response to that sort of organisation, bringing all those organisations and the public and communities together will certainly be a great benefit.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea too. And one of the things that's frustrating as an academic often, and as a researcher, is that often the work that you do isn't put into practice. And it sits on a library shelf or on the internet these days, I guess. And although people might read it, it never actually leads into actual policy and action. And so, if you can encourage people, a cross-section of people, from academics right down to the practitioners, to get together and hear what the latest research is going on and actually translate that into real ideas, that would be great.
Right, thank you.
Thank you. Gindan Island Public Health. Just a response really to your question. I think from public health's point of view, we would love to support you in taking forward those events. But I think it would be, you mentioned health professionals. I think it would be encouraging if we could involve some of the other professionals that we just mentioned around the LEPs, around sort of the wider teams that are working in local government, and also our acute sector, our CCG colleagues, because the interprofessional, what the learning that takes place there in terms of roles and responsibilities, the challenges and the strengths, that's what's the fruitful learning that comes from the interprofessional approach. So yeah, and I take the point of John as well in terms of loads and loads of research and strategies, and it's about how do we make that happen. And I think those are the sort of areas that we need to take this discussion forward to. Yeah. It's all right talking about it, but how do we actually deal with it, and who does what, and whose responsibility, and pooling that resource. No longer can we afford to sort of work in silos. Yeah.
Thank you. Any more?
Karen Saunders from Public Health England in the West Midlands. Completely great that there's going to be some interprofessional learning and throw into the mix voluntary sector as well, which was highlighted by Paul as needing to be more engaged and have a critical role in this. I think we've heard from local colleagues where they've played a critical role in engaging the community. I think I want to go back to something that you said around what our kids to be ambassadors. We want to build that community resilience so that more communities can fend for themselves. And I think we've got a lot of work to do in terms of reframing this one. I think we use very complicated language. It's great to hear it's the weather and more, of course, but I find climate change quite an abstract concept, so I don't know how that then filters down to lay people. And I think there's a real fault line in terms of our communication methods on this one. And I think we've got a lot of work to do in terms of positioning this whole agenda as an issue of social justice, as an issue of health inequalities. And I just wondered if you knew of any approaches where the language had been simplified, communities were engaged, and communities were mobilising themselves to actually do something very positive around this one.
Shall we all have a go?
I think what's been highlighted from on local level is much Wenlock, which is famous for its Olympic connection. That town, because of its risk of firstly flooding, and it tends to be flash flooding, but also in terms of where it sits on Wenlock Edge, means it's actually quite difficult in very bad weather for people to get in and out of it. And also it is a communication black spot at the moment. If you were like my emergency planning team following the Olympic torch, live coverage through Shropshire, we were flying until it got to the centre of the modern Olympics, much it just completely disappeared. That community has taken on a whole range of things about looking at how it builds up its resilience. And so at that local level, it's including things like almost who are the flood wardens, who will be the runners, who will go and look after individuals. So at that level, it's very good, and we're now seeing that ripple across other parts of Shropshire. In terms of nationally, I think what the February storms highlighted was that even for areas like the Thames Valley, this impacts not just the Cumbrias and the Worcestershires, it actually affects every part of the country, and that it brought home to communities that there will be more that needs to be done. The trick will be how do we sustain that, and how do we make sure that people don't think, well, that's it, it's over. We're never going to get that event in the next 20 years. Well, actually, no. If climate change occurs in the way that John was highlighting, then these extremes of weather will continue, and therefore, it's part of our routine planning as individuals, as families, but also as communities, we need to be able to sustain that.
Thank you, Rob.
I think the whole agenda feeds in nicely to community empowerment. I think it's all about dissolving the barrier between organisations and the community. I mean, it was mentioned green infrastructure earlier, and where this has been a great success, like in Seattle, rather than the council going in and planting all the trees, they went along and left trees on the street corners, and the communities themselves collected all those trees, planted the trees, looked after the parks, and then over sort of 10, 15, 20 years, those community groups that started out just about planting trees have grown into much wider community groups that are impacting on policy around climate change and other wider issues. So I suppose it's not, about professionals translating information into language that communities can use. It's more about communities producing that information themselves and leading the agenda. They should be the ones in trying to change society and change the way we do things.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we do need another, as you say, approach to climate change. Obviously, it's been around for a long time, but people get fed up with hearing about it. It's all negative, which is why today I was trying to talk in a sort of positive way about how fragile and small the atmosphere is, and therefore we need to appreciate it. And people obviously don't appreciate the fact that they're breathing it all the time, and also the fact that they're using it all the time, when they drive their cars and everything. So I think there does need to be an awareness so that people appreciate the atmosphere. And we'll have to form, instead of the Cloud Appreciation Society, we should have the Atmosphere Appreciation Society. So that people realise that they have to do something to look after this problem, because otherwise the atmosphere is going to become unusable.
Just a comment that there is a certain, in rural areas in particular, there is a certain pragmatism here, insofar as we've had serious flooding incidents in my division before now. We've got, as a result of that, at least 2 community-led flood action groups. They coordinate themselves with council drainage people. They hold their own meetings. From time to time they come to me as their councillor and ask if I can facilitate something for them, but they're very, very much self-motivated. And they're doing that, nobody asked them to do that. Nobody sent a diktat down from on high saying, this is what you need to do. This was completely spontaneous. And we do have similar pragmatism during for example, bad snow and ice. We have an arrangement whereby we have grit available, and local people that will actually spread that grit. You know, when you're up in the hills, we have farmers who will come and clear the roads. So there is a lot of self-help going on about this. But I suspect that what we need to do is just actually promulgate that more widely, because there is very good practice going on, and I think it's just not well known enough, really. Rachel.
I mean, just listening to this conversation, I agree with what everyone said, and I mean we've been in a recession for what, best part of 5 or 6 years, and you'd think even the financial aspects of getting people to do things would work, but it hasn't, because otherwise everyone's houses in Shropshire would be beautifully sorted out, and people would be saving a lot of money from energy efficiency. 2 years ago we launched an organisation, an umbrella group called Green Shropshire Exchange, and I think public health could very usefully use Green Shropshire Exchange. We represent a forum of interest on the voluntary community assembly for climate change, which hasn't had anyone up until recently. We've got a good website, and I'm happy to do a lot of work on that, and I'm happy to provide that to people. The idea is to get all the groups in Shropshire sort of working together and liaising, together on this. I agree with you, Ross, that people are an asset in communities, but I've worked for 7.5 years in communities in Shropshire, and people are getting old, as you said. We have very good group nouns here. Sadly, most of them died, or had illnesses. We are struggling with Green Shropshire Exchange to keep a reasonable level of the steering group when we should going, because everyone is retired and getting on. So there's a bit of a danger in relying just on the voluntary sector to be good. But GSX is there. We have a calendar of events. We're happy to put information. I'll be putting information from John Paul's presentation, on it, to get the message out. So, please make use of it as a group.
Thank you, Rachel, very much.
I'll happily use it, and I'll happily follow that up with you. You're right about we have to value volunteering, but we can't just rely on it exclusively. Slight digression, but just the point. I'm linked into one of the Olympic legacy programs, which is to encourage people into sports. And so I checked to find out if we had any of those volunteers in Shropshire. And the answer from the national organisation is the official Olympic trust has been established. No, we don't. None at all. And so, even for something which is as high profile as that, and encouraging people to engage in sporting activity, they're not there. So there has to be something which collectively communities and statutory organisations do that. One of the elements for us is James Tozer, who's our local police commander, is trying to encourage just this concept of volunteers in public service, but recognising that if you're going to have those individuals who are working in public service in different capacities, the public services need to find some ways within the constrained circumstances that they've got of sustaining that support. Part of that leads into work that the Clinical Commissioning Group is doing. We actually establish 300 young people as health champions. So not just relying on our retired community, but actually developing this concept of public service and community working within the younger generation as well. And the group that we've got already, 90 in place, are absolutely superb. The lesson for us is we have to sustain that.
Right, I'm conscious of the time. There was a lady opposite you, Rachel. Did you have a question?
No, it was just about, I suppose, community. It was just a comment really, because you say you've got a speaker from Canada, and I was thinking, don't they get fined if they don't clear their own snow and etc.? There is more of a nudge element there, that they have to do it, otherwise they get fined. I don't know if that's true.
Sherry, do you want to answer that one?
It is true.
Yeah.
There are bylaws in place in certain cities in the country, specifically the City of Toronto, province of Ontario.
Yeah, my friend is in Port Elgin.
Yeah, if you don't clear your snow within 12 hours of the end of the snowfall, you could be fined.
Much theory.
Much theory.
Right.
Can we just take one more now, because I'm conscious, yes, it's all right, we're coming. Can you make it quick?
Well, I was going to say Jamie Wrench, give me tarmac and find me if I don't fill my own potholes. I mean, it's actually a concept that we could well start trying to develop here. I was very impressed by some of the things that Rod said. Having just become a sponger completely, I'm conscious of the fact, you know, I'm now on the 45% on benefits. I've got 10 years perhaps before I become quite useless. Right now, however, I'd like to apologise for when I was working for the patronising way in which I treated the voluntary sector. And now that I am in this state of, I would like to warn you that I don't like being patronised. And there is this difficulty that all organisations have of trying to do it themselves and then saying, would you like to come and help us please, but it's on our terms. And there's another little spin-off actually. The greatest public health advantage of my putting solar panels on my roof is that my house is cooler when the sun shines. It's amazingly different. And think about public car parks and putting solar panels on top of those, which would be good. The other downside is that all the new technology I put in depends upon electricity from the grid. If the grid goes down, my solar water doesn't work, my solar panels don't work, my electric cooker doesn't work, my central heating, which used to drip feed with oil, doesn't work. I'm in greater danger now from a power cut than I ever was. So these things can spin both ways. But the answer really is, one of the things as human beings we do, we're very good in emergencies when there's a clear and present danger, and it's one of the problems that climate change has. It's a long time in the future. Perhaps the message that we should take from here is that these things that we've been talking about on the screen today, they were laid down in 1970 and 1980. It's not just going to go on like this, it is going to be twice as bad 30 years in the future. And the preparation that we make will carry its own message to people. The more you're preparing for horrible disasters, then the more people think they might be going to happen.
Very good point, and one actually which I think we can wrap up into the workshops.